Change your brain, change your life. Welcome to the Ketamine Coaching Academy podcast. Join me, Bronwyn Davis, 25 years as a success coach for high performers and the visionary leader behind Conscious Ketamine Coaching Academy, as I guide you through this groundbreaking approach to healing, personal development, and empowerment. Come for the education, stay for the enlightenment, and leave ready to transform. Welcome to the Ketamine Coaching Academy. I am Bronwyn Davis, your host, and I'm so excited about this podcast today because I am here with Dr. Derveer, and there's so much for us to talk about. We've already been chatting ahead of time, but we wanted to make sure all of this was on record so that we can dig even deeper. Dr. Derveer is a psychiatrist, and you are working, right in this space. So I'm excited for us to dig in. It's nice to have you here. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You have been doing your work in this psychedelic space since 2016. I really want to share like the personal story around you entering into this space.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So 2016 is when I first heard about ketamine, and we have to rewind the tape a couple years before that to talk about psychedelics, because I got involved in clinical research looking at the role of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in around 2011 or 2012. And I was part of a team that conducted a phase 2 study here in Boulder, Colorado. And as we started to get toward the end of that study, and I was seeing with my own eyes how quickly people could get well with a very brief interventional protocol and how effective psychedelic therapy could be for the right person, it started occurring to me that as the clinical trial was winding down, I was going to be going back to my clinical work without psychedelic therapy because I didn't know about ketamine at this time. And then I had a patient who asked me if I would prescribe intranasal ketamine. And my response to that was kind of similar to my response to being invited to start being on the MDMA trial, which was, wait a second, ketamine for mental health? I thought this was an anesthetic. I never heard of this before. It sounds really dangerous and scary. But I did agree to look into it, and I started reading papers, and I found a mentor in town who was already doing it. And that led to me getting trained in 2017 in ketamine. And by the end of 2017, I had already offered it to almost all the people with treatment-resistant depression under my care. And it was pretty revolutionary for most of them. And not all of them, but nothing works for everyone. But it provided an incredibly powerful, quick change for many people. So that was sort of the beginning for me. I've taken these steps along the way in my 25 years as a psychiatrist of becoming quite disillusioned and just despairing about the limitations of the tools in my toolkit, and then going and finding something that moves things forward. So ketamine was definitely one of those moments for me.
Share with us a little bit more in detail about you were working with these clients, you started them in ketamine, and the transformation. Like, what were some of the things specifically you were seeing?
Well, for one thing, I was seeing people who had been stuck in depression and trying so many different kinds of medications, different kinds of therapy for years, just not getting well. You see a spark or a light in someone's eyes that you haven't seen before. And I'm sure you can relate to this. So it's incredibly exciting to see people begin to wake up from really long-term, deep, dark depression. I saw suicidal thoughts evaporate pretty quickly. That was huge because, of course, as a psychiatrist, it's hard to sleep well at night when you have people who you are worried about that might not be there the next day.
What do you notice as like the differences between the various psychedelics that you have worked with, including the ketamine?
It's a great question. So, as I said, my first real exposure was MDMA in the clinical trials. I still think at this point, and I can also speak to psilocybin because the training that we offer at our institute covers all three medicines. I'll get to the psilocybin later, but with MDMA, the oxytocin release and the interpersonal trust that develops really fast with the oxytocin allows people to move past the things that we see in ordinary therapy, inhibition, shame, the tendency not to want the therapist to see the deepest, darkest, nastiest, injuries that we carry in our psyche. All of that is accelerated really quickly with the chemistry of MDMA. So it's really incredible to watch people with severe PTSD get well very quickly with MDMA. So I still think that with all the psychedelic options that are out there, my first choice, if everything was available, would be MDMA therapy for people. It's just more consistently supportive for people. Ketamine, I think, has such a unique benefit in the immediate anti-suicidality effects. There's nothing like it. And we know this from the earliest trials of ketamine for mental health, that it was remarkable at NIMH, even in 2006 with Carlos Zarate, like these early studies, they saw suicidality change very quickly, like within 24 hours. So this is a huge advantage of ketamine that none of the other psychedelics have, at least not as consistently as ketamine. Of course, ketamine does have this Achilles heel or drawback that the benefits of ketamine tend to go away more quickly than the benefits from other psychedelic journeys. Just comparing apples to apples, So, and we could talk, I could get on my soapbox later about the concept of maintenance ketamine, because it bugs me that practitioners aren't looking for other ways to help people stay well, but that's another story. Psilocybin, I think, is a really interesting kind of newer option within the world of clinical research. It's a newer option. Mm-hmm. What's neat about it is that it looks like one session, or in some cases 2 sessions, can eradicate depression for 6 months or a year for many people. So, that appeals to me as a psychiatrist who wants to help people move quickly through psychiatry and put psychiatry behind them.
Share with me a little bit about what that looks like when it comes to the integration part for you and your clients.
Thanks for asking that. The advantage, I guess, I had to coming to the work was that I considered myself to be a psychiatrist who was a therapist first and a prescriber second. So I've always been really involved with the psychotherapy with my patients. So the concept of providing ketamine without psychotherapy never crossed my mind. It was never something I would ever consider. In fact, at our clinic in Boulder, we've seen quite a few people who have had traumatic experiences at IV ketamine clinics without a therapist, where material from their unconscious mind is coming in and flooding them, or they're vomiting, or something's happening really scary and intense, and nobody's there to help them. So I've always been insistent that the ketamine is combined with psychotherapy. So the protocol that we have run in our clinic involves at least one preparation session without ketamine, ideally more, but finances are part of the equation, so we have to consider that too. And then we tend to schedule 6 IV ketamine sessions over the next 2 to 3 weeks with a therapist in the room the entire time. And then integration sometimes can begin toward the end of that 2-hour visit, but we also have people come in between their ketamine sessions for integration without ketamine, and to continue integration afterward, ideally. And often people do that with their own therapist, not necessarily one of our therapists. So I'm glad you brought up integration, because as you know, the true work of healing from psychedelics is in the integration. It's not in the dosing session.
Absolutely. I like to describe it as the integration is 90% of the experience.
Yes.
The actual dosing session is just 10%. Especially with
Exactly.
ketamine, it activates the neuroplasticity, but you've got to be able to afterwards direct that into something positive in order to continue to anchor in the new neural pathways.
Absolutely. The idea should be pretty accessible to anyone that achieving well-being takes active participation, right? We have to move our bodies. We need to make good choices with our nutrition. We need to turn off our screens early enough at bedtime that we're not interfering with sleep. We need to have meaningful things that we do with our time every day. We need fulfilling relationships. There's so many things that we need, and they're not given to us. We have to work for them, right? And so what we do in the ketamine work is we try to identify what some of these pieces are in the preparation sessions that the ketamine and the neuroplasticity will allow the person to be able to then access in the integration. So everyone's different. Everyone has a little bit different constellation of challenges in their lives. Some people are couch potatoes. Some people, go to fast food every single day. Other people have really stressful jobs or relationships. But the point is that whatever those barriers are to wellness require behavior change, right? It requires a lot of effort. And of course, when you work with people who are very depressed, you find out pretty quickly that telling someone to put on their running shoes or telling them to go, eat good food is just like, it doesn't make any sense because they need help first. They need that neuroplasticity and that support to be able to go make those changes.
When you are conducting your preparation sessions, what is the goal? I heard you talk about the nutrition piece and some of these other things, but what would you say you ultimately want to make sure has happened in that preparation session to get them ready for the ketamine session?
Well, I think that with the ketamine work, my vision is mostly around two major bundles of root causes of the symptoms that brought the person in the first place. The first bundle is trauma in a person's psychology. So this falls into the world of shame and guilt and negative self-image and negative self-talk and so on. And we see that these themes are very significant in people with heavy trauma loads that they carry in their bodies. And as one of those people myself, I can relate to this. I understand this really well. Yeah. Then there's another bundle of root causes that also need to be addressed in integration. And those are some of the things we were talking about before that kind of fall into what we call lifestyle medicine. So relationships, nutrition, exercise, clean water, adequate hydration, good sleep, and tied in with that, with the lifestyle behavior change, some people need a deeper analysis of what I tend to call functional medicine pathways. So some people, it might sound weird, but out here in Boulder, Colorado, we think of it as a dry kind of desert environment, but we had a big flood about 10 years ago. And many of the homes got damaged with water. And so then there's mold in the homes. And so it became something that got on my radar when that happened, that mycotoxin exposure can have a huge role in the development of depression, for example. So putting it all together, you can sort of see where if one person's depression comes from a mold exposure, eating good nutrition's not going to hurt them, but it's not going to also deal with the root cause because we've got to get that toxicity out of their body, right? So to answer your question of like, what do we do in preparation? We're trying to identify where on the map, and I call it the map because we have a rubric that I can share with your listeners if you want. We can put it in the show notes that shows this sort of way that and how we teach in the Institute, teach psychiatrists and therapists to think this way. Because, we have this concept called treatment resistance in mental health care, where someone didn't respond to X, Y, or Z treatment. And I tend to think about treatment resistance as practitioner ignorance, because my own personal experience as a provider has been that every time I go and learn something new, like the mycotoxin thing, I've got a little bit more of a fuller picture of what impacts a person.
What have you found to be the biggest obstacles as you have been working with your clients, especially with ketamine?
That's a great question. I think the biggest obstacle tends to be affording enough integration sessions. There tends to be, and it makes sense in our culture, we tend to overemphasize the importance of the drug experience or the dosing experience, and we undervalue the commitment or the investment in integration. And so it makes sense from human nature that because ketamine can make you feel so much better so quickly, that you might fall into the mindset of, well, I feel better, so why should I, have more sessions, or why should I do this work? Or do I really need to stop eating fast food? Do I really need to find a better situation professionally where I'm not being abused at work, or so on? You know what I mean? It's hard work to do these changes in our lives.
How do you overcome that rebuttal from people who are just like, nah, I'm fine. I'm good. I got it.
Well, I've come to a place, and I don't know if this is where I'll stay, but the place where I'm at today is trusting that the journey that people are on sometimes takes longer than I want it to take for them. And that, I can live with myself. I can sleep well at night knowing that I've talked about the things that I see that I would imagine that they need to address if they want to achieve and maintain long-term wellness. And I also can live a good life as a practitioner, taking a stand for ethical treatment in my mind. So, for example, refusing to treat people with maintenance ketamine, because I think that maintenance ketamine to me feels way too much like maintenance Prozac or maintenance some other drug. And again, nothing wrong with maintenance drugs that work well for people, but the problem is when you stop taking that drug, your condition tends to deteriorate. So I would much rather work with people. It feels much better as a practitioner to work with people on a deeper level of healing, which I think is quite possible with ketamine when you combine it with therapy, especially, or coaching for that matter.
Yes, absolutely. When should someone consider the therapeutic ketamine treatment? At what point? I mean, I know it's so good for major depression, but what about if someone has high functioning anxiety? And when do you ideally want them to step in?
Boy, it's such a good question. I think when ketamine is provided in a safe environment with a well-prepared guide or coach or therapist, and they've been medically screened, of course, then the likelihood of having something really bad happen is pretty low. I mean, ketamine is pretty safe in that kind of setting. Of course, we know that people like Matthew Perry can, unfortunately have really terrible, lethal outcomes if it's not used and obtained and worked through in a clinical way, right?
Yes.
But I think what I'm trying to say is that I think people can derive significant benefit in terms of self-exploration, getting underneath the default mode network, finding out that there's a world inside of us that is more than just our thinking. This can be extremely helpful for people who aren't necessarily dealing with a clinical level of diagnosis. But I think that the slippery slope, and especially with ketamine compared to other psychedelics, is that it can be habit forming for people. And there does tend to be a little bit of a DIY, mindset with ketamine, given how easy it is to obtain online and so on. So I think there are certain people that's quite risky for.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts and impressions on the DIY, like the type where you can get it sent to your house? How do you personally feel about that?
Well, I think that we're talking about a balance here of accessibility, which includes cost, but it also includes transportation and all the things on the one hand, and then on the other hand, safety. So I personally think it's not a black and white issue where at-home ketamine comes with risks, but it also comes with benefits. So I think that these online outfits that are prescribing or mailing ketamine to people, they're not all created equal. Some of them have therapists on a Zoom screen with the client's at home. They might even send a blood pressure cuff to the client to check and make sure that their blood pressure is not too high before they take the ketamine. If cost was no issue, then it would be great if people were in person with their coach or their therapist or their guide. That would be ideal. But that's not really the world that we live in. So I think it's hard to draw a line there. I know that I'm actually, honestly, I'm a little surprised that there haven't been more instances of someone receiving ketamine in the mail, taking it, getting in their car, and something dangerous happening. It's surprising to me that there aren't more reports of that. But I think it makes sense that people who need help who often don't have access to a high level of care could get benefit in that way. The other thing that happens with online ketamine prescribing is that some outfits will prescribe a single session's worth of ketamine. Others provide, 5 or 10 times that much ketamine. And I think the risk of diversion or the risk of misuse or, children or pets getting into the ketamine is much higher the more ketamine you prescribe someone. I hear stories about clients of some of these outfits being sort of pestered about, hey, it's time to renew your ketamine. And it's like, well, what's the clinical decision-making about that? As opposed to a marketing or a business decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
So there are nuances, but I think there are ways to make that as safe as possible.
You talked about how you were surprised you hadn't heard more adverse stories. Is it because ketamine is relatively safe?
Well, at the doses, especially if we're talking about mail order ketamine, and we're talking about troches or sublingual, only about 20% of the ketamine is absorbed into the body in that way. Ketamine, of course, can be provided intramuscular, IV, even subcutaneous. There's a lot of different ways. So the effects that happen with the oral or the sublingual tend to be milder than intramuscular or IV. So it's sort of hard to describe to someone who hasn't tried it, but it's maybe more on the level of having too much to drink at a party or something like that. It's not, you feel dizzy, you feel a little clumsy maybe, but you're not like blacked out in a K-hole typically with sublingual ketamine. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know. Maybe people are following the directions and not leaving the house on the ketamine. I like to think that. I'm kind of more of an optimist.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know why that is.
Well, Dr. Derveer, I am loving this conversation, and we will be back. We are going to take a break. And when we do come back, there's a lot more for us to talk about, like your institute, as well as your book that's coming out. So I'm excited to talk to you about that.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
This podcast is sponsored by Conscious Ketamine Coaching Academy. Step into the future of mental wellness. I'm Bronwyn Davis, founder of Conscious Ketamine Coaching Academy. This isn't just a career. It's a calling to guide deep, meaningful change. By integrating transformative coaching with therapeutic ketamine, a cutting-edge healing tool, we empower our clients to heal and grow beyond their expectations. Ready to make an impact? Click below to learn more. Welcome back to the Ketamine Coaching Academy. I'm Bronwyn Davis, your host, and I'm here with Dr. Derveer. I am so excited with this conversation. We have really done some deep diving into this topic. And Dr. Derveer, I really love your perspective on how you see ketamine in this space with mental health. You are one of the pioneers starting, over a decade ago. And so I want to hear you. We talked briefly about one of your passions, and you're looking at creative ways to offer lower cost, allowing more and more people accessibility. Share with me about that.
It's an important issue because, of course, we have a mental health epidemic globally, and it's really frightening when you look at the numbers. It looks like a hockey stick. So things have gotten worse every year, since the pandemic, especially. So one thing that is obviously really important is getting parity and coverage through insurance carriers. And so there are people working on that. And I think that we've seen a huge change with Spravato, for example, of having basically no one cover Spravato when it was first approved, and now many carriers cover Spravato. So that's a big change for the better. But we also have, I think, underestimated the power of working with psychedelics in groups. And so when you think about group therapy, some people might think, oh man, that's the worst thing in the world. But but there are incredible benefits of working with psychedelics in groups, and not the least of which is that when you have a dosing session with a group, the experience that someone on the other side of the room is having can be really supportive to the experience that you're having. Now, what we do in group sessions is we have people with earphones and eye shades. Everybody's on their own mat. They're arranged in a circle in a kind of like a yoga studio in our clinic. And you don't really interact with other people when you're on the medicine. But if someone's having a hard time on one side of the room, what tends to happen is the opposite of what you might think. Many people think, oh, well, that's going to be very disturbing, or it's going to interfere with my experience. I'm going to be able to hear them. It's going to bother me, and so on. But with the right preparation and the right introduction to group work, what tends to happen is that you hear someone having a hard time, and that kind of, if you relate to them at all, the first thing that you think of is, wow, I'm just sending good vibes over there because that person's having a really good hard time. And then in the integration circles, you will hear stories like, I really felt the power of the group holding me. I felt the power of the care of the group, not just the facilitators, but the other participants. And I think that's a very interesting, kind of mysterious aspect of group work. And I think it ties into what some of the more indigenous or traditional environments or formats for healing with psychedelics are often set up that way. So Native American church ceremonies with peyote medicine in a teepee, sitting up all night and praying, and everyone's consuming the peyote. Or ayahuasca churches, or ayahuasca tribes in South America, Central America. Psilocybin as well has been done for millennia in circles and groups. So when we talk about cost, I think one of the biggest drivers of cost is having an expensive person in the room with you, one-on-one. Or in the case of the MDMA protocol that I worked on in the clinical trial I was a part of, we had 2 therapists in the room for the whole time, every time. And in that clinical trial, the protocol involved a total of 42 hours of therapist time, times 2 is 84 hours. So when you start looking at cost and the hours of the therapist start to add up, I mean, even if the cost of the medicine is minimal, in that case, with that protocol, you're looking at, $10,000 of just therapist hours, let alone other kinds of overhead that a clinic might have, like rent or a front office person or malpractice insurance, all the things that go into practicing. So I think groups are a really important thing for us to think about as we move forward and try to control cost and make things more accessible to people.
Are you seeing any downside of groups, or is it all positive and it's all working really well?
Great question. I don't think groups are for everyone. I think some people really do get too distracted or disturbed by other people around. And that might also be, in some cases, part of the trajectory of the healing. Maybe you need to work with someone one-on-one for a few sessions. Maybe you can progress into group work after that. Other people do just fine with group work. So I think that's really probably the main drawback is if it's so prohibitive in terms of the anxiety or the fear or the stress, then, that could be an interference in the healing work.
Are there any other creative ways outside of group work that you would see us being able to bring the cost down? Is there anything else?
Well, I would love to see ketamine on Mark Cuban's cost plus drugs, for example. I mean, generic ketamine is incredibly inexpensive. So that is one of the advantages of working with it over Spravato, for example. In terms of the compounding pharmacies, I'm not sure if there's really a lot that could be done there, but that's one of the reasons why we like working with generic ketamine. First of all, we think it's at least as effective as other forms of ketamine, but we also can buy, more doses for less dollars. So we can pass that on to our patients.
You brought up Matthew Perry, so I want to just circle back around on that. What do you think, as you look back on what happened with him? What have you learned? What do you know that could really help us shed light? I think when people think of ketamine now, it has put kind of a black mark on it due to what happened with him. I look at it as an opportunity to share what I do is very different than that. But sure. What have you heard since then?
Well, when I read the news story, the Matthew Perry's autobiography was on my wife's bedside stand. And so I picked it up and I read through it, and it's quite, it's very revealed. He talks about his lifelong struggle with addiction and very severe medical complications of multiple addictions. And I think that when you are treating a person with ketamine who comes in with a past history of multiple addictions, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever treat that person with ketamine, but it means that you have to be a lot more careful. I don't think that the clinical work he was doing with ketamine was done improperly. There's no evidence of that as far as I can tell. But I've also had patients who have a history of addiction in their past, not necessarily to ketamine in particular, who had something happen with the ketamine where they started to crave it or want to use it or try to find it outside of the clinic. So it's a tough call, because when someone's really struggling with severe treatment-resistant depression, and then something new like ketamine comes available and you hear about it, it's like, well, how could you not offer that to the person? But at the same time, what was the impact of the fact that he was getting clinical work with ketamine? How did that impact his decision to go get illicit ketamine, essentially from a drug dealer, is what it sounds like.
Yes.
And I mean, it goes without saying that combining swimming pools or hot tubs with ketamine is an absolute disaster. You think about that. But, it's hard to say. Again, there's no black and white in my mind of, a person has any history of addictive behavior or trouble with substances, and therefore they shouldn't ever have ketamine. There are studies of ketamine as a treatment for substance use disorders. So I think there's only so much that we can do as practitioners to at least ensure that the supply of ketamine that we're providing isn't going to get misused. I think we can do that much, and we're responsible to do that. But as far as like policing what people are doing on the street with illicit drugs, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very sad for someone that young to die from that way. But the other side of it, and I learned this in my work with MDMA-assisted therapy, is that these severe conditions are life-threatening already. People take their lives all the time who have severe long-term depression or severe long-term PTSD. So when you remember that and you think in the big picture of like, okay, well, the people who were trying to help Matthew Perry with medical clinical ketamine obviously were trying to help him, right? And it sounds like it actually did help him. I don't think there can be any fault or any, finger pointed in that direction. And then we can't really control what happens outside of the clinic or outside of the coaching practice. So it's tough. You can always look back in hindsight with 20/20 vision and say, well, I'm going to point a finger at this or point a finger at that. But what's happening in real time is a totally different story as we try to help people.
Yes. And I'm hearing the same thing as far as, the clinic itself. In the clinical experience that he was having, they did everything they could. And it seems like it was in the right way. It was just him choosing to step outside of that setting. When I work with my clients in my practice, it's only one dose. We're only prescribing one dose at a time.
That's great.
Because and anything that's left over, like from their session, is destroyed before they leave my office.
Perfect. That's wonderful to hear. Yeah. It keeps it really safe that way. There's a phenomenon of tolerance that we do see with ketamine. And so when we do our series, as I mentioned earlier, about 6 sessions over 2 to 3 weeks, typically we're increasing the dose every time the person comes back. We don't stay with the same dose every single time. Our goal is to not have people go into complete dissociation, but we want them to have a psychedelic experience so that the material inside of their mind can be opened up and we can look at it and work with it. Mm-hmm. But I think that life is complicated and it's just hard. We can't prevent everything from happening to every person. And, I think one of the most maybe interesting dynamics is the dynamic of personal responsibility, and that, which is such a feature of 12-step recovery, right?
Yes.
And yet those of us, including me on the medical side of interventions and trying to work with people, sometimes we forget what the limits are of our own ability to save someone's life, right? I mean, it's often said around suicide that, if you really want to succeed, quote unquote, it's not really the right word for it, but you want to complete a suicide, don't tell anybody you're going to do it. Right?
Yes.
And I think that it looks like to me, in the Perry situation, that was a part of what happened there. There was no, reach out of, hey, I've gotten into trouble with street ketamine. I need help. So we can do the best we can, right? But there's a lot of limitation on what we can actually prevent.
Which leads us to the Integrative Psychiatry Center of Boulder, which I'm excited to talk about because you have a very specific training program. And what makes your training program different, better than possibly others?
Well, thanks for asking about our training. So the training happens under our sister. So we have 2 organizations. One is a clinic and the other one is an institute. So the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which is easy to find at psychiatryinstitute.com, is where we teach a number of different training programs for all different kinds of mental health licensed providers. So anywhere from a psychiatrist to a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, counselors, the whole gamut. And our psychedelic therapy training is, I mentioned earlier, it covers ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin. It is a year-long program, so it's very dense, and it involves a lot of online learning in live sessions online with faculty mentors and practices and exercises. And we also have, as a part of that program, in-person practicums with psilocybin and ketamine. So that's what we've been doing for the past several years, and we've trained about 3,000 people in the training. So it's been really exciting to see the mainstreaming of this work, and it's also been really a joy to stand for what we've been talking about today, which is combining the psychotherapy with the psychedelic. So helping people to work with psychedelics as a catalyst for long-term change, as opposed to a state change that is brief, and maybe it feels really cool, or maybe it's really scary, but it's a short-term change. So we're trying to help people move. We're trying to help the field move forward in this deeper understanding of what suffering is and how we can overcome it.
What is the biggest draw to come to your training program?
Well, I think one of the big draws is that folks who have been practicing mental health care, whether as a therapist or a prescriber, they've had a certain depth of experience and training that is hard to come by outside of a master's degree or a medical degree training. So in the beginning, we entertained the possibility of allowing people with a little bit less depth in their mental health background. So I think we even had a couple of anesthesiologists who wanted to make a change in their career. And what we noticed was that it was really difficult for those folks to understand really important concepts in mental health care, like transference and countertransference, for example. How do you work with a client who is projecting their father stuff onto you as a male authority figure, right? And have that turn into a therapeutic experience, as opposed to just a repetition of another traumatic experience. So I think that our program is especially geared toward people who already have that foundation under them around working with people in therapy or psychiatry for years and years. And it's not to say that I think psychedelic coaching isn't valuable. I think it is incredibly valuable and important. And it can also lower cost. And we were talking about, how do you lower cost, right? So a beginner coach might charge less money on their hourly rate than, a veteran psychiatrist, for example. Doing integration around behavior change, to me, seems like a great fit for coaching, for example. But to answer your question, I think it's really been helpful for our students to feel like they're in a cohort of people who have a similar depth of training in their background.
I know you have a book coming out. I'm excited to learn more about that. Share with us about your book and what prompted you to write it.
Well, thanks, Bronwyn. The book is called Psychedelic Therapy. It's self-explanatory. And it is aimed at sort of helping people walk through the process of considering psychedelic therapy, identifying where they're going to obtain services, how to pick the right person to work with, walking through the different medicines that we teach in our institute: psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA. What are the differences? How do they work? What to expect in the preparation, dosing, and integration phases of the treatment. And it's all embedded inside of this more holistic or integrative perspective about all the things that we need to attend to have wellness and joy and feel good in our lives. So we're excited about it. I wrote it with Keith Kurlander, the co-founder of the Institute and my longtime friend. And we've gotten some really great endorsements from Deepak Chopra and Andy Weil and a whole bunch of other amazing doctors and therapists. So it's coming out in March, and so I'll be in touch when we get closer to that date.
Absolutely. What do you ultimately want the reader to walk away with from your book?
Well, we want the reader to understand the risks and potential benefits, and to also be less fearful about the possibility of going through psychedelic therapy. Because in my mind, there are at least tens of millions, if not more, Americans who are dealing with very severe mental health challenges who maybe don't ever really think about how much fun it would be to be on a psychedelic, or they're not going to go to Burning Man. They're not recreational users. You know what I mean? And they need help. They need a deeper result than what they've been able to achieve. And we have such a stigma about psychedelics with them being put on Schedule 1 by Richard Nixon. We have this idea that, and of course, ketamine is the exception to that, but all of these Schedule 1 psychedelics are considered in the same light as, say, heroin or crack or other really dangerous hard drugs that people get into trouble with. So we have a lot of public education to overcome those stigmas. So my hope is that the book will help people to rely on the evidence and rely on research and hopefully the voices of ourselves as experts to trust the process and see if it's the right fit for them.
Dr. Derveer, how can people get a hold of you?
The easiest way to find me is to email us on our website, which is info@Psychiatry Institute. You can also find me on Instagram at will.vanderveer.md. Those are places where it's pretty easy to access me. I sometimes post on X, but not as much as Instagram. So those are some of the best places. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Absolutely. So as we are wrapping up now, what is it you would want someone to know? You talked about how there is kind of this stigma around psychedelics. What are some parting words you would want someone to know to help them kind of get over that hump to actually seek out the treatment that they may need?
I think that when we have felt beaten down by long-term mental health challenges, sometimes we forget that the injuries that we've experienced or the traumas we've been through don't make up the complete picture of who we are. And so what I've found in my work is even people with the most difficult, entrenched, darkest conditions can get well if they have the right constellation of support. So I hope that that message is a message of hope for people who might be in desperate places. And I do think that psychedelic therapy has a big role to play for those situations that people get into.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Derveer. This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciated the depth in which you brought to this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been wonderful to be here.